It's really a great pleasure for me to be able to join you even virtually for this Because Health Conference. I think it's a very important conference, and I think that you're beginning with exactly the right idea, which is to actually break the taboos, shatter the myths, and in a sense, question, interrogate the way we've been handling matters. And I think that's really important, particularly for global health, because it's astonishing to me, really, that despite what everything the pandemic has shown us, despite the experience we all have now of the way in which public health is panning out, we are persisting in making these mistakes. And so I want to talk today about how inequality is, of course, a major issue when we're thinking about global health, and it's one of the most important concerns. Both in terms of the ways in which inequalities shape health responses and the impact that health responses have on inequality. But even more than that, I want to highlight something else. I want to highlight stupidity. I really do believe that the way in which we as societies, we globally, we as humanity have responded to health challenges, especially in the recent past, has really been extremely stupid and against our own interests. So if you like, I'm suggesting that the first taboo that we have to shatter is that of not naming stupidity when we see it. And I'm going to identify 5 areas of, to me, very major stupidity that I believe have driven recent responses on health matters. And then we can talk about how we can actually do something about this. So what do I mean about the stupidities? Well, let's take the pandemic as a useful example. And of course, it's still ongoing. We have to remind ourselves that it's not really over yet, that new viruses are emerging. And we all know, we're all saying, everyone is sitting there with bated breath, expecting the next pandemic, and yet we are not preparing for it. We were completely unprepared for the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, it was a surprise, but it should not have been a surprise because many experts had been warning us about zoonotic diseases, many, including the group, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. The year before that had published a report. This is a joint board of the WHO and the World Bank. The year before that, they had actually come out and said, be wary that you could well get epidemics spreading across borders and creating public health hazards, even in countries that see themselves as safe. This was done before the COVID-19 pandemic broke. So we could have seen it coming, we didn't. And of course, we were unprepared completely. But what is more alarming is that we continue to remain unprepared. We continue to make the same mistakes we had made earlier. And what are these major mistakes? The first is nationalism. Now, it's a no-brainer, right? That diseases do not recognize passports and visas and border controls. They go wherever, right? Just like climate change does not recognize any of these national boundaries. Yet we persist in dealing with these at national level. We persist in seeing them as things that we can protect our own countries. We can close our borders and then don't worry about what's happening anywhere else. And we think that if we can somehow fix it for our own population, we don't have to bother so much about what's happening in the rest of the world. It's astonishing that this is really the implicit perception of so many global leaders, including in the G7, but that is true. And that's what we saw during the pandemic. We saw extreme nationalism in the form of grabbing vaccines, hoarding the vaccines, hoarding all kinds of other things like, testing kits, protective equipment, you name it. Anything that could be hoarded was hoarded, not shared. And this is an extreme stupidity because, as we know, in fact, you cannot protect yourself if you allow the rest of humanity to actually suffer. And it's, in the case of health, this is even more direct than it is with various other things where you can actually pretend that it is some kind of zero-sum game, let's say food or grabbing of items and so on. With public health, and especially with diseases that are infectious, it is absurd to think that you can solve it yourself. But what did we see? we saw that the global leaders got together and said, yes, we will think of a system in which we can actually share vaccines, develop vaccines together, share the vaccines equitably. So you created COVAX. It was part of the World Health Organization's ACT accelerator, right? Acting to prevent these kinds of crises. And one major element of it was COVAX, the idea that there would be a global arrangement that would buy vaccines and then distribute equitably. First to the 3% of the population, that is frontline health workers, those who are directly dealing with it and most susceptible and vulnerable. Then to the next 20% of the population, which is more vulnerable, which is, let's say, elderly with comorbidities, what have you. And then to the next round, to their areas where the pandemic is spreading rapidly, you send more vaccines there. Very sensible arrangement. What was the difficulty? The difficulty is that while it was designed in this way, it was continuously underfunded. It needed about 28 to 30 billion to actually do this, $1 billion to do what it had promised to do. It received first 4 billion, then 6 billion. By the end of the second year of the pandemic, it had got to 8 billion. So nowhere near the money that it needed. But the worst thing, the thing that really prevented it, was that COVAX did not say that the member countries who signed on to it should not be doing side deals with vaccine companies. And that's exactly what happened. The major developed countries all went and did side deals with pharma companies, with the mRNA vaccine producers, that is Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, and then AstraZeneca, which was producing an adenoviral vaccine. So they went and did these side deals where they cornered 85% of the expected global supply of 2021, even before the production had started. And so obviously there was not much left for COVAX or any other country to access. And so you got this extraordinary situation where countries like US and Canada had bought many multiples of the vaccines that they needed. Canada at one point had bought 11 times what it needed. The US 4 to 5 times. Many countries in Europe, multiples of what their populations would need. Stockpiling these, still not sharing them, even after you've got access, still not sharing them. And in many cases, when they finally gave them to other countries, the vaccines would arrive in, let's say, Africa, 2 weeks before expiry date. And anyone who has dealt with vaccine management knows that that's impossible. You basically can't use them. You'd have to throw them away. Other vaccines were simply destroyed within the countries. In the US, for example, 60 million AstraZeneca doses apparently just simply had to be disposed of because they were not used. So that's stupidity, right? I mean, anybody would see that as extreme stupidity. It's the idea, like those little toddlers, the little bully toddler boy on the block who goes there and grabs the whole cake and thinks that he can eat it all by himself. Doesn't just deny other children the cake, ends up with a stomachache. So that was the first form of stupidity. The second form of stupidity is, in fact, a more worrisome, deeper one, because it is spreading also into many other crucial areas that we will need much more decisive cooperation to deal with our common challenges. And that is in the area of knowledge. We have enabled a most extraordinary system of knowledge concentration from the intellectual property rights regime. And I have to remind everyone here that, this is recent. This is not something that has been around forever. Even in my own lifetime, a good more than half of my life was spent in a world in which you did not have this really extreme concentration of knowledge in private hands and the protection of intellectual property rights to the point where the most obvious solutions cannot be implemented. So this WTO agreement of TRIPS has generated a system whereby large companies can hold on to their patent rights or their other rights of control over the knowledge, even when a very large part of that knowledge has been publicly funded, whether it's been through public labs that have created most of the background essential knowledge, or it is with direct subsidies that have provided the basis for the last bit, the last mile R&D. This is certainly the case with COVID-19 vaccines, right? We know that Moderna benefited from around 2 billion of US subsidies. It had never produced vaccines before, right? This is a new thing. It's the US subsidies that did it. The mRNA technology itself essentially was developed in public labs, public universities. 90% of that basic knowledge was there. The last 10% knowledge done through subsidies. So Moderna gets money from the US government. Pfizer never did this. Pfizer didn't do any of the R&D. Pfizer buys up the knowledge of BioNTech, a small German company, which gets about half a billion of subsidies from the German government. So these are really companies that have benefited from taxpayer money, indirectly and directly, yet they are allowed to control the knowledge, not give licenses to other producers, not share the basic technologies that would enable other people in the world to access it, control the supply in terms of only what they decide to produce or whoever they choose to license, which is very few. So they control the supply, they push up the prices, they force countries to bid for these vaccines. And the governments that have enabled them to get this knowledge, have paid for them to develop this knowledge, don't put any conditions on the prices, on the need to share the technology, on anything. Stupidity or not, I ask you, it's incredibly stupid for any government to give this kind of subsidy without any conditions by saying, okay, we are giving you all of this money, we're giving you all of this support, but after that, you can keep all the profits. We don't even want to share the profits. We won't tell you anything about the prices. We will pay you your exorbitant prices for buying it ourselves. And we will allow you to hold on to this monopoly and not share the knowledge so that everywhere else in the world, people will not get access. This is really what we did. And we did this, and we continue to do this on the completely fallacious argument that if you don't provide this incredible, obscene concentration of knowledge and this deep ability to monopolize the basic technologies, you will not get innovation. Now, that's nonsense. We know that this innovation occurred because of public subsidies. We know that the history of humanity tells us that innovations have occurred, medical inventions have occurred without necessarily only the commercial profit motive. So the fact that we're falling for it now, and it's a recent, as I said, it's really 30 years old that this whole thing has become so incredibly important. It's a sign, the fact that we're accepting it is a sign of our stupidity. It doesn't mean that the pharma companies are stupid. And it does, probably the states are not stupid. Probably the states know that pharma companies are important funders. They have very powerful lobbies. So the people doing it are possibly not stupid. We, citizens, societies, we are stupid to allow it. And we are stupid because it actually prolonged the pandemic. It made it significantly much worse than it need have been. It actually allowed it to spread in different countries, and therefore you got mutant varieties like the Delta virus, which came and devastated India in the second phase. And we are allowing this to happen. So that's stupidity number 2. Stupidity 3 relates to finance. And again, this is really something that if, let's say, some alien were to come from Mars and look at our societies, they would be amazed, appalled. They wouldn't believe it. They, why are you humans not doing the obvious things of providing the minimum money that you need to deal with different kinds of shocks and exigencies and so on? We have huge inadequacies of finance. And there are several. Let me begin, first of all, with the fact that so many countries have experienced fiscal austerities that have focused on really, whether explicitly or not, have implicitly focused on undermining the capacities of the state. This is part of a broader perception that, the state doesn't do things so well, there are bureaucratic inefficiencies, they're not competent, they're lazy, they're corrupt, blah, blah, blah. Private sector is better. And of course, increasingly, because our economies are so unequal, the poor don't have money to spend on new products. So you need to actually find different ways of extracting from the poor. And one important way of doing that is to reduce public provision and make it all private. And that has many advantages for private players. First of all, it's a private provider who is now getting a profit out of something that would earlier, let's say, be publicly provided, public health, public education, and so on. Then, because people can't afford it, they'll have to borrow. So you financialize, you had yet another layer of profitability in this matter. So much more money to be had once you make it much more a private decision, a private gainful activity for many of these things that were earlier seen as the domain of public provision. Now, this has meant over decades the undermining of public health systems in particular. We know that in Africa, the devastation wrought by the Ebola virus was particularly severe because health systems had been undermined. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic played out really badly in countries that had hollowed out their public health systems and were found wanting in periods of crisis and shock. We know that some countries like Spain actually had to nationalize hospitals in that period simply to make sure that profitability motives did not mean exclusion, denial of the most basic facilities. So we know that not spending on health has terrible consequences, of course, on health, but also on the economy, on everything else, on our societies, on everything. Yet we continue to underspend. Even today, there was a brief period when, especially in the rich countries, there was more spending on public health. In some middle-income countries also, but low-income countries could not. Most low-income countries were still, during the pandemic, spending more on debt servicing than they were on health. And despite the attempts at debt moratorium and so on and so forth, today, more and more developing countries are facing austerity. That's because about 62 of them are in severe debt stress, on the verge of crisis, in some cases actual default. Many others have faced capital outflows and all kinds of other problems, so they're short of foreign exchange. And they simply are unable to make the basic investments that are required to prevent any kinds of, to reduce the shocks and to reduce the inequalities that also add to poor health conditions for people. But let's think of the global stupidity of inadequate finance. We know there's lots of money sloshing around the globe, right? Trillions and trillions of it. And we know that rich countries, when they want, they can suddenly spend, right? We found in the pandemic, advanced economies, they kept telling us, oh, we can't spend, the governments can't spend. They could pull money out of a hat. Suddenly you got fiscal expansion, additional money being spent of anywhere between 10 to 30% of GDP in a year. Imagine, that's the kind of massive increases, trillions and trillions in the US and the EU, suddenly emerging to be spent. Now, some of this, presumably, should go towards global health conditions, because as I pointed out, these are global diseases and they will come back to get you if you do not actually protect everyone on the planet. But I told you about COVAX, which was only wanted 26 billion, didn't get that in 2 years, got 8 billion total in 2 years. Let's think of the pandemic fund. This is a preparedness fund that has been proposed that will allow countries to deal with and prepare. And when they see something coming, a public health threat coming, they can actually take measures immediately. Again, you think this is a no-brainer. This pandemic fund, currently under the World Bank, it said we would like about $10 billion to begin with. Now, 10 billion is not even peanuts. It's not even one peanut. It's not even a piece of a peanut compared to the fiscal expansion in the USA, which, as I said, is in the trillions, right? I mean, it's not even small change. Have they managed to get this $10 billion? No, they're in the range of $2.6 billion after a year. That's stupidity. There's no other word for it. That's extreme stupidity. It's stingy, of course, but it is stupidly stingy. So that's another major aspect of stupidity in our global health systems. But it's not just inadequate finance. The finance that we do give is the wrong finance. That's the other problem. So here we are saying, yes, we must finance, but we can't do it through the state because the states don't have money and they'll never have enough money. So we have to actually do blended finance, public-private partnerships. We have to de-risk the private sector. That's absolutely true. We do have to de-risk the private sector, but we have to de-risk them and simultaneously make sure that they do what they promise. We can't just give them money and say, okay, now go ahead out there. Yes, children, here's your money. Now go out and play. No, that's what we did with the vaccines, and we know what happens. We're doing that again. We're telling governments, you will never have the money you need to spend, so go out there and incentivize the private sector. So we give that. We give public money, taxpayers' money, your and my money. We give it to companies, hoping that they will do some investments, some expenditure, some provision, whatever it is we ask them to do. But we do not require it of them. We don't have any sticks. We give only the carrot. So they eat the carrot and leave. We are not putting the most basic conditions on the public-private partnerships that would ensure that the private investors are aligned with our social goals. And we cannot meet our global health challenges or any challenges unless we make sure that the private sector operates in conformity with the public sector. It cannot just be a free lunch. It can't be a blank check in which there is zero requirement or accountability. So, fourth stupidity. It's not something private players do when they give money or anything. They are very determined about conditions. We, on the other hand, we enable and allow our governments to do precisely the opposite, to basically subsidize companies even when they are not delivering in terms of the public good, the common good. And that's a big stupidity. Finally, I would argue there's another stupidity that has become extremely marked in the recent past, and it was always there, of course, and it's always there in public policy making. That's the nature of human beings as well, right? The obsession with the short-term knee-jerk responses in disregard of the long-term or even the medium-term, or even trying to create a link between the short-term response and what we need for the medium or long-term. Now, climate change is an obvious example. The minute we make all these lofty goals, we go to the COPs 26, 27, 28, whatever, we go to all these COPs, or governments, our leaders go to all these COPs in talking about climate change and saying, oh, it's terrible, and we commit to doing something by 2050. Conveniently, none of the leaders today is going to be around in 2050 to actually be accountable for whether they've done it. Some countries, my own, India, they say we'll do something by 2070. Even more convenient. I mean, clearly, our prime minister is not going to be around in 2070 to be accountable. But in the medium term or in the short term, what are they doing? Nothing, or often the opposite. So in the short term, oh, sorry, there's a Ukraine war. So now we're going to forget about any problems that fossil fuels create. We want to intensify the fossil fuel investments and production. We are worried about rising prices. And so we are going to expand investment in the worst cost fossil fuels. Europe, there was renewed interest in coal investments. In the US, they're investing in oil drilling, in natural gas, in shale, you name it. So the short-term knee-jerk response that we've seen in climate change is also so marked with regard to public health. Because the other thing I want to emphasize, that public health is not just about curative. It's not just even about preventive through a vaccine. It's not only the technologies that matter. It's a holistic system. So you have to think about a range of things. You have to think about nutrition, adequate and healthy nutrition, instead of our broken global food system that is creating unhealthy, unsafe, and unequal diets. So you have to think about nutrition. You have to think about sanitation. Large parts of the world do not have access to proper sanitation. You have to think about clean water, which is being eroded and in fact destroyed by many of the ways in which we are destroying our nature and overexploiting water and the ecology. So you have to think holistically about water as well. Water is also, by the way, another source of huge inequality. It's an area of crisis, and it's something that we have to worry about. Increasingly, the wars of the future may not be about oil, they may well be about water. We have to think about climate change itself and its impact on health. We know that it is generating different patterns of heat and heat stress. We know that it is generating new pests which affect agriculture, we know that it is creating different diseases. So we have to be thinking about that also as a health concern. In other words, we need a much larger holistic notion of health. But in that holistic notion, we can't simply say, well, right now I have this problem, so I'm going to focus on just addressing this little problem, and I'm not going to worry about any of the things. And I'm not even going to worry about whether how I address this problem will affect my ability to think of this entire health system. So that's the fifth stupidity. I was going to stop with the fifth stupidity, but I've just realized that all of these reflect another deeper, wider stupidity. Maybe they're all encompassed in that deep stupidity. And that is the stupidity of the idea that we human beings and we as society, we have to work for the economy. No, the economy has to work for us. We have to think of how to make economies, how to design the rules, the institutions, the processes that meet our social needs and goals, our planetary requirements, our natural, our harmony with nature. We have to think of an economy that meets the needs of what we as human beings want. Instead of saying, well, we have to do this because it will generate more GDP, or we have to do that because otherwise there will be some economic problem. We have to make the economy subservient to society, to humanity, to the planet. And so essentially what I'm saying is that we have been very stupid, we will continue to be very stupid, but we don't need to be. And so if genuinely this conference is about breaking taboos, then because health is so important, we have to break these taboos, and we have to actually recognize that we don't have to be stupid. We can show that we are Homo sapiens, we are thinking beings, and we can think and create ways of cooperation, ways of dealing with these challenges, so that either we are not left with a destroyed planet and destroyed humanity, or deeply unequal, unjust, and unpleasant societies, but rather we are able to show that, yeah, we know what real progress is, and we can figure out ways to get there. So I really hope that all of your deliberations over the next couple of days tread along that path. And I wish I could be there with you physically, but I'm delighted to have been able to at least talk to you virtually. Thank you.